Hi guys, welcome to another Rossi audio video. Today I'm going to talk about a topic that is a hot topic for many. Wires and cables. However, this is not your video about is this cable better than this cable, or this one costs $2,000, is it better than this $100 cable, or this $10,000 or $50,000 cable. No, we're not going to talk about that today. So if that was what you was thinking you're going to see, I'm sorry, I have to disappoint you. I am not a believer of a cable that costs thousands of dollars is way more better or in any way, shape, or form performs better than a couple of $100 wire. So just so that is said. This video is more about copper and OFC, both of them together, like they are one unit here, and then we have CCA on the other side. This video is more about why you should not go with CCA cable, and CCA is copper clad aluminum. Basically, it is aluminum core with a little thin layer of copper on the outside. Now, you might ask, well, I have seen cars, I have heard cars, because this is very typical in car audio, also for home, but mostly in car audio. And people say, well, I've heard these installs and they use copper clad aluminum wires, CCA. Yes, there are cars out there that uses this, and sounds okay. Now there is apparently two different types of CCA cables. You have the CCA cable that just have a thin coating of copper around it, and then you have something called 50-50, CCA 50-50, which is like a mixture of 50% copper and 50% aluminum. It's not that much widespread as pure CCA or just CCA or OFC. So, okay, copper has better properties and better conductivity than aluminum. That's given. There's a huge difference in conductivity. And there's also a huge difference in how these metals rust or oxidize. So the problem with copper is it's a little bit more expensive, and there's a myth that you should have this over that, and there's a lot of confusion around it. So that's the problem with copper, is it's a little bit more pricier than aluminum. Now the problem with aluminum is if you use aluminum as a power cable in your car audio, you are running a high risk of something can happen, something bad. If you run it at a speaker cable, it's a little bit less risky, but it's still there. But the problem with aluminum is, one, the softness of the metal. Two, something called creeping. And three, of course, the rusting. We call it rusting today. And you might say, well, what's the problem with softness? Well, this was proven because some years ago, a decade ago, and I think this was more or less worldwide, but it was a big problem in Europe. A lot of houses was installed with aluminum wires, and a lot of these installs had hot spots and receptacles melting, and those fires started. So a lot of countries put restrictions on aluminum, and even some countries banned aluminum from being used in houses. Transfer that to a car audio and you have the same problem when it comes to the softness of the metal, because when you stretch wires and cables in a car, you have to bend the cable, you have to kind of like run it in between things, and it might get a little nicked here and there, and it's under pressure. And softness of the metal means that there's easy to create nicks and cuts and crushes on the cable, and this creates inside a cable hot spots. And hotspots in aluminum wires can create and will over time create overheating of the cable and will melt the insulation around it. And then we're talking about full-blown fire after that. So that has been a problem both for home and house use, but also in automotive and other applications. So softness of the metal is one thing that is a problem with aluminum. And if we take that a step further, that means that, okay, we have to, because there's another thing here, and that comes on the creeping on the next thing, because softness is number one. So we can take this directly over to number two, which is creeping. And creeping means that when electricity or heat or energy flow through a wire or a cable, that's heat. Energy and music signals are energy and heat. That's basically what it is. And when you send heat through a wire and a cable, when that wire and cable is aluminum, and this goes for all, even copper, but when aluminum gets heated up, it expands. And when it cools, it contracts again. It expands and contracts, expands and contracts every time you use it and not use it. So let's say you're running around and you're playing music and you're using your car audio system or your house speakers. Every time you use your system and you use CCA, your cable expands, and then when you turn it off, it contracts again because it gets cold. And it is this repeated usage and repeated motion of heating, cooling on the aluminum that is bad. And that means that when you cool it down, you get the creeping effect. And this expansion and contraction and expansion will and can cause, and this is why they in home use and why electricians for homes, they had to come up with special receptacles and special wall plates and all that stuff to prevent the aluminum wire from expanding in and out of the connections. And if you think that you have an amplifier in your car and you have CCA cables hooked into the speaker terminals or power terminal or ground terminal, and this heating and cooling effect goes on with expansion, contraction, expansion, it was proven in homes, in receptacles, on and on switch and wall plugs, that when aluminum wires were used like that, they kind of like expanded out from their connection point, and they created points where electricity could arch out from. And it also created hot spots there. So you could see a lot of receptacles melting and catching on fire. And this can happen also in car audio. I'm sure you have seen car amps where the connection, the speaker terminal connections and the power and the ground has melted. Yeah, that's many times because of aluminum wires being used. Because there was nothing wrong with the amp, there was nothing wrong with the speaker, but all of a sudden the little terminal for the power in or the ground had melted and caught on fire, or that's a big burn spot right there. And I've seen it even on speaker terminals. And this becomes a problem, a bigger problem, the more wattage you're using and the more energy you're putting out from the amp to the subwoofer or the speakers. Mainly we're talking about subwoofers, that's because those are the ones who's seeing the huge amount of power and energy and heat. So the creeping effect can result in loose connections and overheating and arching. Rusting or rust or oxidization or whatever you want to call it. The thing with copper is when copper oxidizes or rust, it creates this green layer. The thing with that is it doesn't affect the flow of energy or heat or whatever, power or whatever you want to call it, because it's conductive. It's still conductive. The rust on copper or the oxide on copper is conductive. And you can see it like, just to mention, take this a step further. When you see steel rust, it becomes red and you get this rusty red color. And copper turns green when it rusts or gets oxidized. Aluminum gets like a white coat cover when it starts to rust or oxide and oxidizes. So the problem with the aluminum here, once again, is that white rust on aluminum is not conductive. And when we know that copper is like 99.9999999% conductive, or even more, there's a chart for it. I can see if I can find a link. I have the chart. And we know that aluminum compared to copper is only like 65, 66, 67% conductive. When it starts to rust, and that rust is not conductive, but it's kind of like an added film to make it less conductive, then you see that the conductivity of aluminum is way less than copper. And this is also a problem, because when aluminum wire rust with a white oxide, and it's not very good at conducting the heat, the energy, or the flow of electricity, this can, in many cases, and will, cause overheating of the wire. And when we know that aluminum has a very good way of storing heat and hold on heat, that's one of aluminum's best and the strengths of aluminum is to kind of like capture heat and hold on to it. So then you might ask, well, why do they use aluminum chassis on amplifiers? Well, that's because the amplifier gets warm inside, and you have to have a way of getting the heat out of the amplifier and away from the PCB board and the motherboard and all the other electronic components in there. So they use aluminum to take the heat out of the amplifier. To be able to do that, having an aluminum chassis that is just like one big lump of aluminum is not a good way to do it, because then you're just storing heat and energy within the amp. So you have no way of getting that heat kind of like cooled down or taken away. So a big lump of aluminum chassis is not the way to go. If you see the bottom of the one on top there, it has big fins. You can see it on the bottom. It has big fins, and many of them. This is for air to travel through and to cool down the aluminum. So the aluminum soaks up the heat from the amplifier, and the outside air cools it down. When you have an amplifier that has one big chunk of aluminum, it takes a lot more to cool it down. Cools down slower, your amp runs hotter. So you want to have big fins of aluminum when you run aluminum chassis. And most amplifiers are aluminum chassis because of the way they capture heat and holds onto it. And then you use the fins or fans to cool down the chassis. So when you think of aluminum wires, they get warmer than copper, faster, and they store this heat longer. If you have created hot spots on your cables or wires because of the softness of the metal, then you get these dangerous hot spots where heat can build up and melt the insulation. And this, I'm not saying that this happens in a day or a week or a month, but it depends. It really depends. Have you stretched your wires under your seat or something like that, and you just got a little bend on an aluminum cable? You can already have created a little crease or nick or a little bruise inside the metal, and voila, you have a hot spot, and this builds up over time. I have in fact seen personally in real life, CCA cables, most of the time, it is the power cable from the battery that has gotten a nick or a damage to it and creating a hot spot and caught on fire. Then you might say, well, if you had used a fuse correctly, blah, 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 blah. This happens so fast, so, yeah. If you have underdimensioned your fuse, if you're not running a fuse that is not up to what the system is, yeah, you can run into problems. But I have seen CCA cables in real life really cause havoc. I have even seen it on speaker wires. Now, some people might say, well, I don't hear any difference in my speakers when I listen to music. I don't hear a difference between running CCA or copper or OFC. Well, there's another factor to that. To have the same conductivity in an aluminum wire or CCA, you have to go, let's say you have a 14 gauge copper wire. To get the same conductivity and flow of energy, you have to go down to a 12 gauge CCA cable. Then you get about the same. So thinner copper wire can give you a certain result, and to get the same with CCA, you have to have a thicker wire, just because to compensate for the conductivity. Now, I'm not going to say that sound quality wise that there's a huge difference, but there's a difference on the property, the quality of the metal itself. And to me, aluminum wires are a safety issue more than a sound issue. However, with less conductivity, your amplifier and cables and speakers that are working together will get a different result than if you use copper. Because as we know, impedance and all this stuff is being affected, the resistance in the cable. And this may, if you build up less conductivity, that will equal to more resistance in the cable. And more resistance in the cable will affect your amplifier at some point in some way. So if you run a shitty, cheap, poor quality amplifier, you might run into problems. A better amplifier might be able to handle the bigger difference in the cable and the bigger resistance in the cable in a better way. But like I said, you affect everything. So to me, it's not okay. I have used CCA cables and they sound okay. I use them here in the store for demos and all kinds of stuff. Sounds okay. But it's the quality of the metal. That's why you should not use it. And it's all about the fact of the properties of aluminum compared to copper. Not specifically OFC, but copper itself. So if you think about it, the problems with aluminum is the softness of the metal, the creeping that happens, and the rusting. So those three elements are what should make you stay away from using CCA cables. If you want to use it, go ahead. It's not going to do very much to your sound. Maybe microscopic sound results, because you can always use a bigger cable that is CCA than copper, and you can kind of compensate for the conductivity. But like I said, softness, creeping, and rusting are the three big bad things with using CCA and aluminum wires. So there you go.